Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. In the month or so since he became President of the United States, Donald Trump has issued a series of executive orders and made several pronouncements which are unprecedented both domestically and internationally. His administration has done away with thousands of federal jobs, and diplomatically, he has shaken the world, including his allies like Canada, Europe, and Ukraine. His interest in buying Greenland and turning Gaza into a holiday resort have shaken up the world. Some of his decisions have economic repercussions, and India is one such country which will have to deal with the imposition on duties on Indian imports. These came soon after Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the US, where India agreed to purchase high priced American aircraft and oil. How should India prepare for diplomacy Donald Trump style? And what will be the economic and strategic impact of what the US is likely to do? To discuss these and other questions, we have Sanjay Bhattacharya, a former diplomat, with us. He is a former ambassador to Switzerland, Turkey, and Egypt, and has served in Hong Kong, China, and several other countries. He specializes in diplomacy for an era of globalization and transformation, boundary negotiations, and security issues, among others. Sanjay is now professor of diplomatic practice in Jindal University and is a regular speaker and writer. Sanjay Bhattacharya speaks Chinese fluently, which should help him understand and interpret the Chinese perspective. Sanjay Bhattacharya, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you for having me on the show, Siddharth. It's lovely to be.
Sanjay, what do you make of Donald Trump's second presidency so far? He has already upended American diplomacy. Has he now settled down, or is there more to come?
I think the one thing that he has not upset the boat on is about the expectations that he is going to be unexpected. He lives in a very difficult world, a very different world, and he believes that disruption is the way forward for setting the new world order that he wishes to establish. I think it was in his first term itself that he had referred to the America First principle that he wanted to espouse and set forth for his country. And it obviously meant that it would have consequences for the rest of the world. And despite the gap of 4 years during which Biden tried to do a reset, uh, it does appear that Trump, in his second phase, wishes to go back to the old agenda once again. So it's going to be a reset in terms of diplomacy, in terms of alliances and partnerships, in terms of how economics works, and how he views the new world order that's emerging.
Many of his ideas look plain absurd on the face of it. The plan to drive out all Palestinians from Gaza and turn it into some kind of seafront resort is perhaps the most audacious. Surely this cannot be part of a new world order.
I think there is some criticism which is not entirely unjustified that he often has a real estate developer's perspective to various global issues. But I think it's a little more detailed than that, although the very idea of a Riviera on the Gaza might seem audacious. I think it goes back to the earlier Abraham Accords that he had unfolded in his first term. And I do anticipate that the very idea of trying to seduce the Saudis into the game in a much more intimate manner is perhaps one of those things that he wants to do so that he can have another reset on the Palestinian issue. So, can there be Abraham Accords too? And I think, to my mind, that's what he's going for, although it may have manifested itself in Riviera on the Gaza. The Greenland issue, for instance, another one that he talked about, is another one in which it seemed audacious because he just wants to buy sovereign territory. that has certain allegiances to itself and to Denmark. But he has couched it in the framework of a security requirement that the free world needs. And so it's in a different context, and perhaps there is something of a deal, and he is in a debating sense putting out the extremist position first. And look, it's not just Greenland either. There's been talk of Panama as well.
And Canada.
Yes, of course. The
And
51st
Canada.
state.
Yeah. No, so you are saying is he starts with the maximalist position and then works his way backward. It's so you can say that he is consistent with what he has proposed, the Abrahamic Accord number one, and moving forward 4 years after a 4 years gap. But consistency by itself can't be a virtue. I mean, think of the people of Palestine, Gaza. Think of the people of the other countries. There are people involved.
I agree entirely. I think while there is no denial that Israel has a right to peace and security, so do the Palestinians. And therefore, the conflict that that has been unleashed um, is something that has a humanitarian perspective, which is often lost sight of. And the Palestinians have been at the raw end of that particular stick. I'm actually quite pleased to find that the Arab countries to whom the initial appeal was made to welcome the Palestinians who would have been forced out of their homes, imagine being forced out of your home, and the Arab countries have actually been fairly steadfast in opposing that idea. It is not to say that there will not be greater pressure on them, and they may not bend a bit if it might, but the fact that the Arabs have tended to reject that notion is, I think, noteworthy. The Palestinians have a right to their land and their homes, and I think that is something that needs to be understood by all the parties concerned. But at the same time, this region has been in a state of conflict for the last 8 decades or more, and it is time that we seek a new way to bring about this particular settlement, which will provide some kind of security to both the Palestinians and the Israelis, and provide the prospects for peace and prosperity to the wider region.
Yeah, except that I don't want to go too deep into that subject, but just to leave that, taking off from Gaza, except that there is no acknowledgement by Trump or by the Americans and the Europeans, in fact, that the bombing of Gaza, where they've killed 45,000 people, including children, has to be seen, it can't be seen purely as a way of securing um, Israel's peace and prosperity. It has to have some kind of repercussions. And yet, everyone's going around inviting Netanyahu to their countries. So that
So
acknowledgement has to be there.
I think the kind of excessive action that has been put out has perhaps diminished the security of Israel, although it might seem that in the current context, it has been able to gain the upper hand. I have been of the view that such violent action of such a nature and such a scale actually diminishes, and I think other ways need to be explored rather than the brute use of excessive force.
Okay, you wrote recently in a newspaper that the Trump's diplomacy could reshape the world and global alliances, such as the long-standing transatlantic alliance between the US and Europe, which has stood through thick and thin. And now it looks like Europe is starting to get insecure, and that looks like it will change.
I think changes are afoot. And what Trump essentially wishes to do, because he has a notion that America is in deficit because America has been subsidizing the rest of the world. He believes that the rest of the world should pick up some of that share that America has been paying for their economic growth or their security. And therefore, this issue of burden sharing, as I put it, is something that Trump is very eager to push to different parts of the world. And this is manifesting itself both in the economic as well as the geostrategic domain. In the economic domain, of course, it's the question of tariffs and that he has unleashed. But in the geostrategic domain, what it means is that the burden of contributing to security for defense and the kind of defense expenditure that different parts of the world have, including allies, will need to be buffeted so that the American share goes down, and ostensibly the Americans would be better off within their country. Now, whether this is a viable notion or not, I think will unveil over time, because what it tests is the old nature of alliances in which America, in a sense, was the leader of the Pax Americana. But today, what America and Trump are trying to say is, I want to be Pax Americana, which is the leader of the world, but at the same time, we need Europe to take its share, we need Japan to take its share, and of course, he even told Mr. Modi that he can look after Bangladesh. So this is a new compact that Mr. Trump is talking about. Uh, it is in some ways more in line with the multipolar world that one talks about, but not quite in the same context.
Come on, like countries like Germany, for example, because they were hampered from raising a standing army for a long time. I think, am I right? Uh,
That's
yeah, and America stepped in, and most of Europe and Japan, as you point out, and so many other smaller countries. Now, these the European bloc and Japan are economically still can manage it, but smaller countries so may not be able to cough up their share. So, are you saying that he is asking them to pay to raise their own security barriers and leave America out of it, yet accept America's power, its status as the number one player in the world?
broadly, yes. And I think this, in a sense, predates Trump to some extent, where, at the turn of the century, the Europeans in particular were urged to look at a larger share of defense expenditure. With the rise of the idea of the Indo-Pacific, which actually happened before Trump came, although the Quad was consolidated in his time. During Obama's time, the pivot to Asia and the rise of the Indo-Pacific, Japan and Korea were being asked to have a larger share. So this has been happening, and I think Europe has responded already. Europe has responded in terms of increasing the share of its defense to GDP, and we've got comments from France, Germany, and UK on that. I think there is a fundamental issue over there. The Cold War that came about after the Second War was one in which the Americans were positioned against the Soviets, and the Western Europeans were dragged into that particular dogma of having to fight the Soviets. And the Eastern Europeans somehow had to be aligned with the Soviets. But once the Cold War came to an end and the Soviet Union became Russia, and although Russia did have some of the old ambitions of the Soviet Union as well as of the old imperial Russia, it was not quite the same. And in some ways, Russia was really trying to reach out to Europe and be recognized as a European power. And I suppose if the security structures, the breakdown of the Warsaw Pact on the one hand, but the continuance of NATO on the other hand, convinced Western Europe that they could continue with this idea of having the opposition across the Urals. And that has persisted to date. What has happened is that the European consolidation in terms of its economy has produced a a marvel in terms of the economic union, of the technological capabilities that Europe has produced. But because of the fact that they have continued with this old notion, this 20th century notion of you got to think of Russia as the opposition, they've not been able to advance as much as they could. To some extent, Germany did try to bring bridges with the Russia that was the new one. But of course, that was not did not continue for a very long period of time. And Russia, of course, did not help its cause entirely because, in terms of the kind of freedoms that it would provide, was not exactly salutary or an example to countries in what was earlier Eastern Europe who wanted to follow the Western European model. So I think that conflict needs to be resolved, and to define whether you need an adversary, and if you need an adversary, whether that must be Russia, has to be rethought, and Europe has to do that. I'm happy that the recent trend in which Germany has a more assertive leader, in which Macron has to fight with right-wing trends within his own society, will probably bring about a greater realization, and a sense of realistic liberalism, which will bring about this new order.
Well, if you notice that point of Russia being the perennial enemy may become kind of moot, given that Mr. Trump is building his barriers with the Russians. So it should become easier for the Europeans.
I actually noticed this, for the first time, Russia and US voted together on a resolution which involved the Ukraine issue. And it is quite amusing that on the Ukrainian resolution, they both opposed it, whereas on the quickly drafted U.S. resolution at the General Assembly, in which the French were able to bring in an amendment in which they talked of the large-scale invasion by Russia, and U.S. did not actually withdraw the resolution, but then abstained on that particular resolution. But it
On
did
its
go to
own
the
resolution. On its own
yes.
resolution.
Yes, on its own resolution. Imagine abstaining. It could have withdrawn the resolution itself, given that it was the popular sentiment in the General Assembly was not for it. But it did bring in a resolution in the Security Council, which sometimes is a little more meaningful, in which you did find that Russia and the US again voted alongside. It was calling for peace and for an end to the war. And France, which tried to bring the amendment, did not succeed because of the US and force in the Security Council, where the dynamics are different. And France and UK then abstained in that vote. But Russia and US again voted together. So it's a very interesting development. And I think what that actually opens the gate for, and there was this point of time when the G7 actually became the G8. And there's no reason why Russia should not become part of that understanding and that particular compact, in which there can be a more collaborative, cooperative effort. I knew there has been disillusionment in the past, that the civil rights aspects of it were not always fully developed in the manner that the West had thought. But I think this is a new time and a new era.
So, given all that, and given the way the Russians and Americans have begun to inch closer together, given that the Europeans are not fully on board about it, where does that leave Ukraine?
I think Ukraine has a real chance now, because I thought the Ukrainians had a real chance when the Turks were actually mediating, and they'd got the Russians and Ukrainians into Istanbul for the agreement, and they did have a draft. But I think the Europeans were more keen at that point of time to label Russia as the aggressor rather than save the Ukrainians. I'm putting it in very blunt terms, but perhaps that's the way I look at it. Because sometimes you do feel that the lives of people are perhaps more important than discussing about the nuances of who started the war, which is very complex anyway. And then when the Europeans initiated various peace moves, including the very celebrated Swiss move, they never invited the Russians. So how can you have a peace on Ukraine in which you do not invite the Russians? So I think what Trump has done is to bypass these two forces, the Europeans and who are more keen on labeling Russia as the aggressor. And you look at the amendments in the Security Council that they sought or in the General Assembly, rather than bringing an end to the war and saving lives. So I think the fact that they've been able to get the Russians to Riyadh, which the Russians have grabbed, and despite the fact that in this initial stage, we see still some bad blood between Trump and Zelensky. But I hope that will kind of mellow over a period of time, because Putin is quite convinced, and he said as much, that there can be no peace without the participation of the Ukrainians. I do fear, of course, that the Ukrainians will probably get a somewhat rough deal at the end of it. But I think they will have peace and they will save lives of Ukrainians, which I think perhaps in my mind is very, very important. So I'm actually optimistic about the possibility of a ceasefire, if not a peace, and then they can work out the mechanics.
Okay, moving on now to the something that our listeners may want to know much more about. You conclude this article by saying only in one paragraph that this could represent an opportunity for India, all these resets. How so?
Well, India is definitely a growing power. And in this nature, although we are not growing fast enough, our influence in global issues is still recognized. And if there is a global reset, and if we can position ourselves appropriately, and it's not just being the voice of the global South, but it's also being a voice for liberal values of principles that will apply to the others on the top table. There is an opportunity for us over there, and I think in that we will need the partnership of the United States, just as we will need the partnership of the Russians and the Chinese and the Europeans. And so it's going to be an interesting couple of decades ahead in which this one unfolds, even after Trump leaves, because I think this has got to happen.
Well, in fact, some of President Trump's moves will have a strategic impact on India. There's a feeling that the West had always seen India as a bulwark against China and therefore supported no matter what. But can we take that for granted anymore, given that Mr. Trump may have other ideas? He may want to build bridges with China himself and leave part of Asia to the Chinese. I'm just building a scenario. Can we take the American support to us for granted?
I take your point entirely, and I think India has never been able to take the US for granted, and perhaps rightly so. We have to develop close contacts and engage with the Americans very deeply for the purpose of economy, technology, and even the geostrategic dynamics that is emerging. But I don't think we would benefit from being an ally of the United States. And I say this because the United States looks at its own interests in a much more focused manner than most other powers tend to. And therefore, if it kind of collides with that of others, then the US will not necessarily continue. And it's not simply the question of withdrawal from various theaters where they have been involved. And I think, that raises concerns amongst the existing allies of the United States. But for those who are hoping to be potential partners of the United States in the new order, like India, it is important for us to maintain a certain degree of autonomy in our decision-making processes and that certain sense of ability to align with different forces. And it's not an easy task, but I think we will have to keep our eggs in different baskets.
And what are those baskets? What may they be?
I think primarily I see the world emerging in which, apart from the United States, we will have significant forces that will be China, Russia, Japan, and Europe. And I think we need to be aligned with all of these, not as allies, but as responsible partners. And I think we will have to engage with them at those different levels. For instance, with Russia, we have a long-standing partnership which is built on trust. And it is often said that the Russians are perhaps the only country that have not let India down. So that is one part of the geostrategic equation. I think we've got a huge potential of a relation with the Europeans, which has not been explored fully. The kind of capabilities that the Germans and French, in particular, have in the European continent will provide us with what the future of India will unveil. And as we become a little more advanced, many of those technologies and future of jobs will be those that we will actually have to seek much more actively. With Japan, I think we have two very important elements of our partnership. One is the kind of economic, technological relationship that we have nurtured over the decades. And the other is that in all senses, we also need to have a certain kind of counterbalance to the threat of China if it does emerge. And finally, when it comes to China, I think we have to recognize that this has become our neighbor and we have to live with China. And there will be bits of competition and collaboration which will have to coexist, while we will have to thwart the possibilities of a direct conflict. And I think if we can manage those three C's of conflict, collaboration, and competition, we will work out a normal balance with the Chinese as well.
So far, Mr. Trump, I mean, though he welcomed Mr. Modi as in his office, and the fourth country, I believe, a fourth leader who met him. Prime Minister Modi went to the US, but he's come back committing to buying defense and energy supplies. But the moment he returned, import tariffs were imposed, and I don't think certain sectors, especially like pharma, will able to withstand it. So it's not something that we can fully fully take for granted that Mr. Trump will be including India in any of his initiatives beyond a point. The Americans imposed tariffs on our goods, and some tariffs have begun to come down quietly. He imposed tariffs on the Chinese, and the Chinese imposed tariffs right back. So, do you think that he is not going to look at us and say, well, these guys will do what I want them to, so I don't need to take them seriously beyond a point? I'm just conjecturing.
You're right, Siddharth. I think on that very day that Prime Minister Modi met with President Trump in the morning, he had announced the executive order on retaliatory tariffs. Trump has a fairly simplistic way of dealing with trade. And it seems to be that, if he were to wage tariffs, then that would bring the other side to the negotiating table. And then he could work out whatever the deal is. And to some extent, I think he has been able to get people to respond. And of course, these are initial responses. What we do see are two things that are happening at the same time. The first one is that the multilateral system has totally collapsed. So you will have to do bilateral or regional deals. And when it comes to the United States, I think what has happened over a period of time is that there has been a groundswell of bipartisan support for India. And this is at a broader level. And so even before Trump and even after Trump, I expect that the Americans will wish to engage with India in a positive manner. But that does not mean that Mr. Trump will always be benevolent. And the issue of retaliatory tariff is one. The fact that, you alluded to the fact that, we had reduced tariffs in the recent budget on some of the items which were of Trump's interest. And that was, in a sense, so to soften the kind of reaction that might come about. And it probably had some kind of an effect, because if we were to get into a tariff war, like some of the others have tried to, I think the reaction, the impact of it is generally, in statistical terms, in the research, it is seen that they can be damaging to both economies. And I think the kind of reaction that you see from Canada and Mexico are, in a sense, somewhat different. Although, both have been imposed with tariffs, but there is a deferment. In the case of India, I think the fact that they have agreed to have a trade negotiation will mean that this issue of tariffs can find some balance. Because at the end of the day, we do want our pharma, our textiles, our agro products to go to the US. What we also want is that the other issue of people going to the United States, that immigration channels don't dry up, and they don't have to take recourse only to the illegal ways. So the legal ways of migration should be made available. So I think this option of looking at a trade deal does provide for a scope for negotiation in which we can find a certain balance. The second aspect that has come about is that they have talked of more than doubling the trade to $500 billion. Now, that is more than optimistic, because in a period of 5 years, if they were to do that, that would be fantastic. But what it does say is that when you do look at expanding the size of the cake rather than sharing the cake as it is, they can be more for both sides when you expand the cake. And the third aspect, and I think, and this is important to note, is that there are these SOPs as well as threats which are coming up. For instance, the threat of having to buy more energy. Why should a country like India lose the flexibility of buying cheap oil on the market if it can? Why should it be committed to buying expensive American oil or hydrocarbons? The second thing is the SOP, which is of high-tech defense equipment. And I do think in some ways this would be beneficial, given the kind of infrastructure that we have. And we do hope that the negotiation would also work out something on the technology transfers, which the Americans have often been reluctant to part with. But also, sometimes some of these platforms, for instance, the F-35, is a ridiculously expensive platform. And can India, even with the kind of state that its Air Force is in, with depleting number of squadrons, is that the best option? So I think it's a mixed bag, as I see it, on the economic front. But what has happened is that the dialogue has expanded from simply make America great to also including the considerations of what our nation needs. And so there is now scope for some negotiation.
And how do you are a Chinese expert, you must be reading the Chinese media. How do the Chinese see Trump?
The Chinese have been wary of this and have been watching very carefully. So while Xi Jinping declined to attend in person the inauguration invitation that had been extended to him, he did send his vice president to sit in his place. The Chinese have also not sought a very early meeting between Trump and Xi Jinping. And I think they're assessing the waters. The Chinese are under great pressure in the domestic environment. And so with the low level of demand and the declining growth and the age profile of their society, China has to do several things to kind of sustain its growth momentum. And so it does not wish to upset a major power and partner, economic partner at this point of time. Uh, what they have been doing is to show that they will act with strength. And so the retaliatory tariffs that they have announced is one such measure. The announcement of the AI advances is another such measure. And the kind of impact that it has had on the American stock markets has been quite remarkable. And just today, I understand Jack Ma has announced another new AI development, which is going
Yes.
to come to the market, which will have its own impact. The Americans had been trying to bring about a system of technology denial in which the Europeans would also incorporate it, but the Chinese have responded on the manufacture of chips to show that they can probably do many of these wafers with their own kind of capabilities. So I think the Chinese have responded to Trump with a fairly robust kind of a response. But at the same time, they do not wish to have this personal interaction with this mercurial person who might be somewhat unpredictable right away. They will need that summit level engagement to define the contours of the understandings that they might wish to have, because China, like America, would wish to place its priorities first.
That gives me a kind of, this is an idea that has been discussed, and it brings up, uh, should shouldn't India also show off its technological strength? It can't show the size of its economy, perhaps, but certainly on the tech front, India has the qualities, has the personnel, has the skill sets to come up with all those things that the world will want, like AI technologies, AI innovations and breaks. Will that be one way, like the Chinese, of going forward?
I think India has made some progress on the tech front, particularly when we look at the frontiers of science. With the exception of some space level issues, on many of the other tech issues, whether it is on AI or on new industry, uh, our progress is actually somewhat modest in terms of the achievements that have been attained globally, particularly the tech leaders. We have made great progress in terms of renewable energy, and that is something that is connected to the climate issue. And I think that could be something which we could showcase. I think for India, tech is more in terms of excellence in manpower or excellence in terms of human individual capabilities, which have gone and powered tech revolutions in an environment outside India. But they haven't quite done so within the Indian environment. And therefore, in order to continue the sustenance of that flow, is something that would be to our interest, because as we have realized over time, some of this then tends to come back. And the enabling environment within the country is also growing. So I would be more cautious about the kind of uh, scenarios that we can create in the tech world or the examples that we can set.
Well, I'm just going by what the kind of joyful coverage one reads in the pink papers every morning, as though the best thing since sliced bread has been found. But let me not proceed on that. But finally, my last question: uh, how do you think, with a man like President Donald Trump on one side, capable of shaking up the world, reset, you have used that term a couple of times, with capability of shaking up the world, shaking up allies, uh, how does that, how does the future look? And I would like you to, while you're taking stock of where you see things going, also mention where India will fit in the whole thing.
I
So
think
this has to be quite a global globe-trotting thing.
right. So that it was not really expected that Mr. Trump would come back, but his stranglehold on American polity obviously seems to be stronger than many liberals in that country would have thought. Um, but he has revolutionary ideas, and I think what he does, because he does not accept the status quo, is that he sets all others into a rethink of what they are, in a sense, comfortable with. And therefore, that churning of ideas is extremely important. And it is not that they need to eventually align with Mr. Trump's values or his views, because there are large centers of power and development all across the globe. And they will all have their independent trajectories. But I think many of them had become somewhat slothful, just as we were before colonialism, the colonial powers came into India. India had become a decadent society, and in some ways, that is the kind of hubris that needs to be shaken. And I'm so happy that it is being shaken right at the center of where enlightenment, in a sense, had started. The recent phase of enlightenment in Europe. And so that particular movement, I suspect, will bring about new ideas and new alignments and new technologies which will drive the future. I think what they will also have to do is to do this balancing between these two large entities, which are the United States and China. And if America was able to free up Russia from the shackles that it is in, the Russians could become a more dynamic element as well. And I think with that kind of dynamism in the world, in which there will be a real conversation about how the future needs to unfold. India, which has a certain voice as a country that is principled and of values, will have a certain role. Besides the fact that India is definitely the fastest growing major economy, although if you were to look at it in per capita terms, we still have a long, long way to go. And I think that should be the driving force for India to improve the conditions of its own citizens so that they can be contributing members of the global community. Because without that, India will not have a global role. And it'll just stay confined to the contribution of values and principles. At the end of the day, hard power matters. And India still has a lot of steps to take in that direction. So I do see that the realignments are beginning to unveil. And in some ways, this rather disruptive element of Trump's personality has played a provocative role in stirring that. But I do believe that the end product will not be the vision of Trump, but the vision of all these different elements running their own trajectories. But having stirred the pot, it'll be a better brew.
It'll be a better brew. That's a very, very optimistic future scenario painting. Normally, people, when they talk about President Trump and so many other things, tend to become gloomier and say that, and you are looking at the whole thing as a positive manthan that may come out of all this. Thank you very much, Sanjay, for this sweeping look at the world as it is and as it is becoming and as may become in the future. And only a diplomat or academic can look at these things in this holistic way. That was Sanjay Bhattacharya, diplomat and former ambassador to several countries, and now a full-fledged academic at the Jindal School in near Delhi, telling us about what to expect, telling us how he sees the Trumpian and post-Trumpian world. We are already talking of the post-Trumpian world, if you please. We'll be back once again with another guest next week. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the Wire Talks team, goodbye.